I'm Michael Acock. I'm our lead pastor here at Christian Fellowship. If you're a guest, welcome. Glad to have you. We're in the middle of a Mark series, so this is week 8. We're getting close to Easter. As I think about this morning, there's going to be a lot of text again, but I'm not going to hit them all. So if you're like, why didn't you preach on that one? Again, this is the series that we're looking at the forest, not just every tree. I think Jesus has given us something this morning for us to see so that we can learn to see the kingdom. All right? And so as we do that, though, I just was thinking about a little time that I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago. It was in May, and Jill had invited me to say, hey, we're going to meet a couple at Las Margaritas or something, a Mexican place. Why don't you meet me at this time? And it was a little earlier than normal. She's like, can you leave the office early? And I was like, yeah, sure, I can probably do that. So I walk around the corner, and there is a massive set of like 3 tables, and there's like 25 people. I recognize everyone at the table, but I don't know why they're there, and I don't know why I'm there, and they're all clapping. And then I realized that they had gathered to celebrate my birthday. But it took me, I was literally the waiter comes and says, do you want something to drink? And I'm still trying to figure out what's happening. You know, have you ever had that experience where you're like, something's unfolding, I'm in it, clearly, but I don't actually understand what's happening. And then somewhere about 5 minutes in, Jill's like, we're celebrating your birthday, in case you haven't figured that out. And I was like, okay, got it, I'm on board. But that's the case, is that sometimes we get in these places where we have eyes that can see, but we don't understand. And so sometimes we're really close to something. Like Jill was there, friends were there, some of the staff was there. We're really familiar, so everybody looks like they should belong, but I don't know why they belong in this moment. And I'm kind of confident that it's about me, but I don't know what it's about. And so I'm just missing it. And this is the story of the disciples in this set of passages that we are going to look at today, which is just this idea that Jesus is coming to be what? A servant king. We've known that from the beginning, that Jesus is destined to the cross. We know that that's where the Gospel of Mark is going to take us. And yet we have disciples who along the way have been thinking they're on the inside. They keep kind of finding that they're on the outside because they're like, I don't understand what he's doing. And then people are being encountered with Jesus and they're finding, oh my goodness, I'm in the kingdom. I'm experiencing the kingdom. And the disciples are still asking questions. And so today we have this big frame, okay, this big frame, the kind of, I'll call it the Markan sandwich because we've been using that lately. And it's from chapter 8, verses 22 to 26 is the first one. And then all the way over to 10:46 to 52. Okay, so we're going to look at a lot of text this morning. We're going to kind of go through it fairly quickly. But we have the healing of the blind man that Steve ended on last week. And then we're going to end with the healing of a blind man, Bartimaeus. And the reason why Mark's doing this is to say, look, Jesus is giving sight to people. And this whole story in here is the disciples learning how to see. And so that's the question for us, is it's not about whether we believe in Jesus. We can all say we believe in Jesus. The question is asking us, what kind of Jesus are we seeing? What kind of Jesus are we actually seeing? So let me go through the book. And so we're going to go through these texts and we're going to do 4 different passes. The first pass, we're just going to look at the 2 healings, the 2 blind guys being healed and given sight. Then we're going to come back and we're going to look at Jesus' predictions of his death and his resurrection. And then we're going to look at the disciples' response. And then we're going to look at Jesus' redirection. All right, so 4 times we're going to go through the text really quickly so that we can get a hold of what's happening for us. So to begin with, let's look at chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and he led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked, do you see anything? And he looked up and he said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. And then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And then he sent him to his home saying, don't even enter the village. And then if we skip to chapter 10, verses 46 to 52, we see Bartimaeus. And they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting on the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out, and he said, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, and Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he's calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed Jesus on the way. So the first blind man gets healed in 2 stages. And sometimes we're like, well, that's weird. Why did that happen? Was Jesus not able to do it in one? That's not really the question. The question is actually, how do we learn to see? Sometimes very slowly. And so this is actually about the disciples who are they're seeing, but they're seeing things fuzzy. And then they're going to come to see things more clearly. And in fact, in this particular one, Jesus doesn't necessarily say, come follow me. This man just received his sight and then he's sent on his way. And so this man becomes the living parable for the disciples in these passages, as well as for us. Is that sometimes we see, but we need Jesus to help us see clearly. And the second blind man, he's Bartimaeus. And he is similar to the woman who said, let me just touch his garment. So here's a blind man hearing that Jesus is walking by. Can you imagine the crowds that were around Jesus? And the picture of this moment is a man sitting on the side of the road with a cloak down on the ground, because that's where he got his money. People would give him money. That's how he would live. And he hears that Jesus is passing by, but there's crowds around Jesus, so he has to yell over the crowds. And what do the crowds do? They say, just don't be a bother to Jesus. So the crowds actually try to silence him and leave him in the margins. And Jesus stops. And he says, this man has asked for sight. And he gives him his sight. So the first blind man sees partially. And the second one sees clearly. And when you see clearly, you understand how to follow Jesus. Do you see the picture? This is the bookends of the passages that we're looking at. So the bridge between these two healings is Jesus is going to try to help his disciples see clearly what kind of Messiah he really is and what kind of kingdom he's actually bringing. And so if we remember the map, there's this place. Bethsaida is kind of right here. Bethsaida is kind of right in here. And then they go up to Caesarea Philippi, which is way up here, actually up here, off screen, okay? And then they come back down in here. And then eventually the blind man, where's he at? He is in Jericho. Why Jericho? Because this is the turning point of the book of Mark. End of chapter 8, chapter 9, Jesus says, all the rest of the story is about me going to the cross. I have to go to Jerusalem. And so we'll get down to Jericho, and then he makes his journey over here. So that's where we're orienting ourselves, is because Jesus, most of this is walking. So this is a very kind of slow deal, but it happens over the course of a few weeks' time. And so these disciples are experiencing these moments with Jesus, but it's all on the way. If you read in Mark and you read through chapter 8:22 all the way to 10:52, you keep seeing on the way, on the way. Everywhere you see on the way, circle it and go, the cross. On the way to the cross, that's what Jesus is doing. All right, so the pass number 2, let's just look at the 3 predictions that Jesus gives. The first one is this, 8:31. He says, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. So Jesus speaks about suffering, rejection, death, and then resurrection. So Jesus makes it clear here. The kingdom comes through the cross, not around it. This is what he's speaking. The second prediction is a chapter later in chapter 9, verse 31. For he was teaching his disciples again, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will what? Kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. Betrayal, death, resurrection. This is what Jesus is bringing them into. And so Jesus keeps saying the same thing, but the clarity is not coming from repetition alone. Have you ever when you have little kids, you say, I need you to do this. And then they go, and no, I need you to do that. And you're like, you're not listening. This is kind of where Jesus is at. Like, guys, you're not listening to what I'm saying. This is what's happening. And then the third way is in chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. And Jesus foretells his death this time very explicitly. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. That's going to the cross. And Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, deliver him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him, kill him, and after 3 days he'll rise. He's very detailed, very explicit, and says this is unavoidable, guys. This is what's going to happen. The cross is not a tragic interruption to Jesus' mission. It is the mission. And if you're in the kingdom, he's saying this is where the kingdom goes. And can you imagine? It's a fun little line right here. It says, and those who followed were afraid. Maybe somebody was getting a clue. Maybe somebody was starting to get a clue. This guy's going to Jerusalem. He keeps saying people are going to kill him. And we're following him? This is crazy. This is a bad idea. This is kind of what's happening. Each time Jesus tells them what must happen, the disciples keep responding in a way that reveals how much they're not actually seeing. They're seeing something. They're seeing a Jesus, but they're not seeing Jesus clearly. And so if we go back through this passage again, we'll see where the disciples have misunderstandings. And so we have this great passage that Judith shared at communion. Peter resists the cross there in 8:32, but before that, he confesses Jesus as the Christ. So in verse 27, in chapter 8, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist, or others say Elijah, and others say the prophets. And he asked, but who do you say I am? And Peter answered, you're the Christ. And then Jesus strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And then in verse 31, he says, the Son of Man's going to suffer, be rejected, and he's going to die. And he said this plainly. And then Peter takes him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter. And he said, get behind me, Satan, for you're setting your mind on the things of God, not on the things of God, but on the things of man. So here we have this great moment, and I think it's really helpful for me because it's a moment that as I just thought about Peter, I thought about my own life, I thought about our lives, and there's these moments when we get it so right. We see Jesus so perfectly. We're like, oh my goodness, you're the Messiah. It's you, Jesus, you're the one. And then within a few verses, Peter's like, Jesus, come here, Jesus. We're not doing the cross thing. That's uncool. That's not a good Messiah. And then Jesus looks over at the whole group and he says, get behind me, Satan. And you're like, dude, that's so harsh. It's harsh, but the reason why is because Satan is the king of this world. And what Peter was doing is saying, I want a Messiah in the way that the world would get a Messiah. And so it's the voice of Satan that is doing that. And if you read Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 to 11, you see the temptations. And the temptations are, Jesus, have all the power you want, no cross. Just bow to me. And that's what he's rejecting in Peter's voice. And so the temptation is to have a crown without a cross. And then in chapter 9, verses 33 to 34, we hear after the second time that Jesus says he's going to Jerusalem to die, when they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked, what are you discussing on the way? So again, they were on the way to the cross. Jesus is ahead of them. They're hanging out in the back. And what are they having a little conversation about? They kept silent, for on the way they'd argued with one another about who was the greatest. So right after Jesus says the second time, I'm going to die on a cross, I'm going to be resurrected, they're having an inward focus on measuring their status at the end of the day. They hear Jesus say death, and they respond with ambition. And then the third one is James and John, chapter 10, verses 35 to 37. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want for me to do?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right and one at your left in glory." So get the picture. Jesus is on the way. So he is always leading this tribe of people to Jerusalem because his head is set in that direction. His heart is set in that direction. And so the group is following him. So you got a group following back. They've had some discussions about who's going to be the greatest. And then James and John are like, hey, all right, so maybe he's going to die, but he's going to be the king. All right, so if he's going to be the king, let's make sure we got a spot. So James and John run up and they go, hey, Jesus, well, those guys left the rest of the guys. They come up and they're like, Jesus, hey, could you do something for us? And he's like, what would you like me to do? We'd like to be on your right or your left. And he's like, oh, that's not for me to decide. God's already decided that. And then it says that the disciples got a little bit disgruntled. They got disgruntled because James and John jumped ahead of them, They're not disgruntled like, oh, we get it. We're so righteous. We understand what Jesus is doing. And so why would you guys ask that stupid question? No, they're like, dude, you guys jumped ahead of us and asked the question and you left us out. That's why they were disgruntled, because they're still not getting it. And so the thing is after Jesus has made the absolute most clear prediction of his death and resurrection, we still have disciples seeking power and proximity. They want the kingdom, but they want it on their terms. The disciples are not confused. They are resisting a kingdom that threatens all self-centeredness. And then Jesus does these great gifts, and he redirects them to start to say, let me redirect you so that you can actually see clearly this kingdom. So the first one was Peter getting rebuked and said, Satan, get behind me. And he's just naming the ruler of this world and saying that thought did not come from the kingdom of God, that came from the kingdom of this earth. And then in chapter 9, verses 35 to 37, Jesus recenters the vulnerable in front of the disciples. He sat down with them, called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And then he took a child and he put him in the midst of them, taking him in his arms. And he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. Jesus is taking these guys who are asking about power and authority and being able to be great in the kingdom, and he sits down. And somehow there was still a crowd of people around him, and there was a child. And he just brings a child right up here, and he sets this child on his lap. And he says, the only way you're ever going to see this kingdom is like this little child. And if you actually would see this child, you would see who sent me. He takes the most vulnerable person in the room, because children, they got love from their parents, but for the most part in society, children weren't even allowed to have any status. They weren't allowed to be just keep them quiet, keep them away from the adults. And here the disciples are sitting around, and this is like the crew of the kingdom, and Jesus just brings a little child right up into the midst. He says, this is the kingdom. And they have to wrestle with the fact that Jesus has a child on his lap. Jesus doesn't redefine greatness with some idea. He redefined greatness by a person a child. He says, if you welcome this child, you welcome me. And then Jesus predicts in chapter 9, verse 42, we're just going to look at that one verse. He says, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. That's a pretty good warning. And the other warnings come along. They're like, hey, if there's things that cause you to sin, get rid of it. It'd be better for you to be lame and crippled and go into the kingdom than to have all of your faculties and miss it. These are hard words from Jesus, but he's trying to help the disciples see that it's not your status that actually gets the kingdom. It's actually who you see that gets the kingdom. And he says, and if you cause one of these little ones, so it could be children, but it could be all the people who are weak and vulnerable, like a blind Bartimaeus on the side of the road, who you go, the crowd says, be quiet. Jesus doesn't need to mess with you. But Jesus stops. And this is who he's saying, look, if you cause one of them to miss the kingdom, it would be better for you. This is why the kingdom is important, for us to understand how to see. Jesus speaks most urgently when the vulnerable are at risk. In fact, there's a text in here that I'm not using, but it's on divorce. And the idea was that men in that particular culture were divorcing people left and right. They just had to write a certificate because that's what Moses said. And there was a couple rabbis who were kind of leading the charge, and they had different reasons. One of them was like super progressive. If your wife burnt the meal, you could divorce her. Okay, I mean, it was like uber progressive, but it was always about the men getting whatever they want, and then women being exposed and children being exposed to vulnerability and weakness, no one protecting them, no one covering them. And so their questions about divorce and Jesus' answers were actually to recenter them to say, men, stop it. You're meant to be here to protect and to look after. Because he's redefining what it means to see in the kingdom. And the last one is this, chapter 10, verses 42 to 45. And Jesus called them and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their greatest ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus is saying, look, if you're in the kingdom, it's not going to go the way you think. It's not powerful. In fact, greatness equals serving. Authority equals self-giving love. The Son of Man came to be served. Not to be served, but to serve. And he gave his life. So this is Jesus is like, I'm going to the cross to give my life for something. I'm serving. I'm not supposed to be served. And he says, this is the most clear way you can see the kingdom, is that we serve. And so when we just look at what happens when we begin to see clearly, is this. He changes who we notice. When Jesus heals our vision, he doesn't help us see him more clearly. He actually changes who we notice in this world. I mean, that's so often our prayer, isn't it? It's like, Jesus, help me see you. And he's going, if you see me, you're going to see a whole lot more. You're going to start seeing those in the margins, those who are crippled, those who are lame, those who are blind. You're going to see them physically and spiritually. We begin to notice who's been overlooked, who's been silenced, who's been pushed aside for efficiency. In the kingdom, the margins matter because they matter to Jesus. We redefine greatness as self-giving love. Discipleship isn't about becoming impressive. It's just about becoming available. Think about parenting or leadership or marriage or church life. They're all places where we look to the interest of others. So to be Christian in parenting, to be Christian in your marriage, to be Christian in leadership, to be Christian in the church life is to look to the interest of others. Clear sight always moves us towards mercy. In the crowd that rebuked blind Bartimaeus, Jesus goes through the crowd and finds him on the side of the road. Calls him, says, "Come, what can I do for you?" So let me give us a few stories really quick that help us or hurt us from seeing the kingdom. The disciples don't miss Jesus because they're stupid or because they're faithless. The disciples didn't reject Jesus because they were evil or because they had no faith or belief. They miss him because they were trained by other kingdoms, other stories. And before we cast all of our judgment on them and go, man, how did they miss it? We need to ask maybe the stories that have trained us. So I think there's 3 stories that have trained us. These are the ones that convicted me this week, and so I will share them with you. Maybe. Maybe not. There, got it. The story of comfort. A good life should not cost me this much. We came to Jesus and we go, hey, I came to you to comfort, and it shouldn't cost me as much as it's costing me. Any of you ever thought of how much following Jesus cost you? I think it was just a few months ago, I wrote in a little note in a journal, and I was like, Jesus, this has cost me a lot more than I anticipated. The story of status and greatness. My life is measured by where I rank. That's a story that we've all been given. If you live here in America, that's the story that you've been given. This is true. And the story of power without any cost. Winning matters more than faithfulness. And so if we're going to think about these 3 stories, let's just look at the story of comfort. In Mark, Peter is rebuked for telling Jesus not to suffer. Because Peter believes that suffering doesn't fit his vision of how a Messiah is supposed to come. And the disciples repeatedly move away from pain, not towards it. And so what's at work here in the story of comfort is a belief that God's favor is revealed through ease, safety, and protection from loss. But just a few weeks ago, we talked about an unpredictable Jesus. And so if you're living by a story of comfort and you're saying, Jesus, I want you to come like this, what happens to us is comfort becomes a sign of God's favor on us. Pain becomes something that we avoid and we never enter. Faith becomes a way to manage life and not lose our lives for his sake. So when comfort becomes our highest value, suffering people become interruptions to our comfort. Comfort makes the cross look unnecessary, and vulnerable people look optional. The story of status and greatness. In the book of Mark, the disciples argue about who's going to be great in the kingdom. James and John are seeking honor. And what's at work here is this zero-sum vision of life where worth is achieved through proximity to power. We all have that temptation. If I could just be close enough to the person who represents power to me. Why are we tempted by that? Because status tells us that we matter and we have worth. Achievement equals identity. Success equals divine blessing. Leadership is about visibility and influence. Comparison gives us an identity. If I can compare myself to someone else's situation, then I can decide where I belong and what I need to do to be better than that situation. And being above someone just feels safer than being with someone who I can't fix. Our world trains us to climb to the top, and Jesus keeps calling us to descend lower and lower. In Jesus' world, greatness is not proven by how many people you notice, but who you're willing to notice. When greatness is the goal, the vulnerable are always in the way. The last one, the story of power. James and John don't ask to serve. They just ask to be in the glorified positions of the right and left. In the book of Mark, the temptation is always a Messiah with no suffering. Authority without service, power that protects itself, glory with no cross. And what we see at work is a vision of a kingdom that looks a whole lot more like Rome than Jesus. And in our Western imagination, power is control. Influence is domination, and winning is faithfulness. But if we have any Christianity, any version of Christianity that preserves power by silencing the vulnerable, then we've departed the way of Jesus and the way of the cross. Because systems get protected, abuse is minimized for the sake of the mission, and those who speak up are silenced. In fact, N.T. Wright says it this way. He says, when God wants to take charge of the world, he doesn't send in the tanks, he sends in the poor and the meek. Any kingdom that requires the vulnerable to suffer so the powerful can win is not the kingdom of God. These are hard. It's not been a fun week. Because if we listen to these, it reframes us. It puts us where we're supposed to be right now, on the way to the cross. So that when we watch Jesus next week enter Jerusalem, and we watch Jesus go to the cross, and we watch him die, we're invited to go with him and die. So that on Easter morning, we're resurrected to see the kingdom that we're actually a part of. So Jesus reframes the disciples. He reorients their vision. He doesn't argue with them. He places a child or children right in the center. He warns fiercely about harming anyone that's considered a little one. He stops for Bartimaeus. What's he doing? He's retraining their imagination about where God might be found. You see, the disciples are looking for a Messiah who looks like Rome. Just not Rome. They're just like, no, the Messiah is going to come and take care of Rome, but it's going to look just like Rome when it's over, and we're going to have power like that. And he's going, you're looking in a place God's never going to be. He's like, let me tell you where it's going to be. It's going to be over here, in a place where everything you've wanted, everything that you thought was what you needed, isn't what you need. It's going to be found in those who offer nothing to you. So Jesus doesn't ask us to admire the cross. He asks us to follow him into a life shaped by it. And so as we think about the practicals of just walking out today, just ask 3 questions. Where has comfort shaped my faith more than compassion? Who becomes invisible when I pursue success or security? And how might Jesus be inviting me to use what I have to protect rather than preserve myself? These are not quick questions to be answered. They're ones to sit with Jesus. Allow him to see you. Allow him to help you see. So Bartimaeus might lead us this morning in our response. Let's stand together. He didn't ask for control. He didn't ask for certainty. He simply asked, when Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? He said, Jesus, have mercy on me. Help me see. That's what we ask this morning. Jesus, have mercy on me once again. All the stories that have framed the way I think it should be, have mercy on us once again. That we would see, so that we would be a representation of your kingdom. The servant king still stops for blind beggars. And in these stories, those are the ones who got to see. So he still invites us, blind beggars, to follow him on the way. So as we consider prayer this morning, got a couple things. One is this. Last week, Joe Belzer had a sense of the Lord giving a word, and I just want to share that because I think it met today. He saw in the room, we'll call it a principality, and it was a blue hand that reached through the ceiling, and there were blue strings that were tied to people's hearts. And the strings were called control. not wanting people surrendering to a walk by faith or a walk of trust. And then there was a video that we shared of Katie's testimony about tithing, and he said he saw like half of those strings get cut. And there was an invitation to trust because Jesus' hands came through the ceiling and there were gold strings, and we were invited to grab a hold of these gold strings. But the trust is this, is to let go of my demand that God work in the way I expect. We're the disciples. We all have what we want him to do for us. And he says, but I only have one way to go. And so the trust is to trust that you're not going to get lost. If you lose your life, you will find it. So I invite you to respond maybe to that word. And then we have Nate and Danelle Prevet and Phil Dowse. They're going to be going to Uganda. I think they're going to be in the second meeting, so we're going to be praying for them as they leave this week. And then if you need prayer for anything else, we invite you to come. Let's respond now.